General Sauer, could you give us one example of a permissible restriction on the authority to remove a principal officer?
We don't believe there are permissible restrictions on principal officers of the United States who exercise the executive power. Now, there may be separate issues relating to particular historical pedigrees.
In this case, in a multi-body agency such as the FTC, is there any permissible restriction?
No, this court in Trump against the United States held that the president's power to remove officers wielding the executive power is conclusive and preclusive.
How far do you go with that? Can it be arbitrary, completely arbitrary?
It is conclusive and preclusive, so any review of arguably bad reasons for the president to remove an executive officer would be subject to the political process. It would not be subject to judicial review.
So you just watched that, and you need to understand what just transpired in that sterile hearing room, because this is not some abstract academic exercise in constitutional interpretation. This is the moment when the scaffolding of Republican government gets dismantled before our eyes by the very institution tasked with safeguarding it, while the lawyer for a president who already attempted one coup stands there calmly explaining that yes, actually, the president can fire anyone for any reason or no reason at all, and no court can even examine whether those reasons were corrupt or criminal or rooted in rank vengeance, because the president's power over executive officers is, and I want you to hear this language, because it comes straight from the Supreme Court's own ruling in Trump v. United States, conclusive and preclusive, which is legalese for absolutely uncheckable, beyond scrutiny, a black box into which democracy's light cannot penetrate. When Thomas asks whether the president's removal power can be completely arbitrary, the government lawyer affirms that any review of arguably bad reasons would only be subject to politics, not judicial review or statutory limits, and if your blood isn't boiling yet, then you haven't grasped what's happening, because we are watching in real time as the Supreme Court weighs overturning Humphrey's Executor v. United States, a 90-year-old precedent protecting independent agencies from presidential interference, a precedent that Project 2025 explicitly called ripe for revisiting, and perhaps sooner than later, and sooner has arrived with a vengeance, because this hearing occurred literally December 8, 2025, which means this isn't hypothetical fear-mongering about what might happen. This is the authoritarian machinery grinding forward right now. Let me take you back through the last 6 months so you understand the full horror of what's unfolding here. Because in Trump v. United States decided July 2024, the Supreme Court determined that presidential immunity from criminal prosecution presumptively extends to all official acts, with absolute immunity for acts within exclusive presidential authority, including execution of laws and control of the executive branch, a decision that former federal Judge J. Michael Luttig stated has no support whatsoever in the Constitution or in Supreme Court precedents for the past 200 years, and is irreconcilable with America's democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law. But the conservative supermajority didn't care, because they were building towards something, constructing a constitutional architecture of untouchable executive power brick by brick. And now we see the next phase as the Supreme Court appeared likely to allow Trump to remove a Federal Trade Commission member purely for policy reasons, rolling back 90 years of precedent in a decision that would expand presidential power, transforming 24 bipartisan agencies that Congress designed to be insulated from political interference into instruments of direct White House control. And here's where it gets truly chilling, because the Trump administration has prioritized dismantling that independence, and the court's Republican-appointed majority has been helping him do so across several agencies whose work affects critical aspects of American life. We're talking about the agencies that regulate your food safety, your workplace protections, your consumer rights, your election integrity, all of it now potentially subject to the whims of whoever occupies the Oval Office. Now let's talk about what Clarence Thomas is doing in this exchange, because this man, this justice who received luxury vacations from billionaire Republican mega-donor Harlan Crow, totaling millions of dollars in gifts that were not disclosed as required by federal law, even though Thomas knew he was legally required to disclose them, this same justice who only began receiving lavish gifts from wealthy conservatives after complaining he was paid so poorly he was considering quitting, gifts meant to ensure conservative justices stayed on the bench to benefit donors across the court's caseload, is now pressing the government lawyer to articulate a vision of presidential power so sweeping it would make the framers weep, asking repeatedly whether there are any permissible restrictions on presidential removal authority, probing the outer limits of executive omnipotence like he's shopping for the perfect authoritarian framework. And when you understand that even a former Thomas clerk, originalist legal scholar Caleb Nelson, has warned that the court's interpretation appears to be moving toward a sweepingly pro-president position, that in the case of a president bent on vengeful, destructive, and lawless behavior could do lasting damage to our norms and institutions, you realize we're past the point where conservative legal theory offers any restraint whatsoever, because even originalist scholars who clerked for Thomas and whom the court relies on frequently are saying the text and history of Article 2 are far more equivocal than the current court has been suggesting, yet the 6 conservative justices plow forward undeterred by history, precedent, or the screaming warnings from every corner of constitutional scholarship. The doctrine animating all of this is called unitary executive theory, and you need to understand it's not some dusty academic concept but rather a belief championed primarily by conservative justices, the Federalist Society, and the Heritage Foundation since the Reagan administration, that holds the president has sole authority over the executive branch, which sounds reasonable until you realize Donald Trump exerted greater control over the executive during his presidency than any modern president, often citing Article 2 by saying, "I have an Article 2, where I have the right to do whatever I want as president," and Project 2025 proposed using the theory to justify giving Trump maximum control over the executive branch, with the Trump 2024 campaign platform including an expansion of executive power grounded in this theory. So when Chief Justice Roberts stated in Trump United States that the president occupies a unique position in the constitutional scheme as the only person who alone composes a branch of government, he was codifying into constitutional law a vision that was emphatically rejected 7-1 in Morrison v. Olson in 1988, with only Justice Scalia's solo dissent embracing the unitary executive theory. But now Scalia's view is likely that of the 6 conservative justices and may be adopted in Trump v. Slaughter and Trump v. Cook, meaning a fringe constitutional theory rejected by overwhelming majorities a generation ago is about to become the governing law of the land through the raw exercise of judicial power by an unelected supermajority. And let's be brutally clear about what's already happened, because since Trump returned to office in January 2025, he has fired without cause members of the FTC, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Surface Transportation Board, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and has asserted power to fire officials in bodies set up by Congress, not even under the executive branch, including the Library of Congress. The Supreme Court already allowed Trump in the opening months of his second term to fire almost everyone he wanted, despite the 1935 Humphreys executor decision, prohibiting such removals without cause, including provisionally removing Rebecca Slaughter from the FTC in an emergency order with justices voting 6-3 along ideological lines before even hearing the merits. This is how authoritarianism advances in the 21st century, not through tanks in the streets but through a leader who comes to power democratically, then erodes checks and balances by filling the civil service and key appointments with loyalists, including prosecutors and judges, then attacking media, universities and NGOs to blunt criticism and tilt the electoral playing field. A survey of more than 500 political scientists finds the vast majority think the United States is moving swiftly from liberal democracy toward authoritarianism, with democracy ratings plummeting from 67 after November to 55 weeks into Trump's second term, a precipitous drop representing consensus. We're moving in the wrong direction. What makes this moment so terrifyingly consequential is that the Supreme Court appeared poised to side with Trump and allow him to fire Federal Trade Commission members without cause in a significant case on the structure of federal government, with the conservative majority signaling Trump is likely to win by allowing Rebecca Slaughter to be removed while litigation continues, and when all 6 conservative justices indicated during oral arguments that a president should have absolute control over the leadership of any government body carrying out executive functions such as rulemaking and law enforcement. We're watching the final vestiges of the administrative state's independence get incinerated in service of what scholars are now openly calling competitive authoritarianism. Because understand what regulatory capture means when Justice Kagan warned, the result of what you want is that the president is going to have massive unchecked, uncontrolled power, not only to do traditional execution, but to make law, while Justice Jackson cautioned about the danger in allowing presidents to replace independent commission members with loyalists and people who don't know anything about agency expertise. We're talking about Trump firing the scientists and economists and subject matter experts who stand between corporate malfeasance and public safety, replacing them with sycophants whose only qualification is their willingness to bend every rule and regulation toward the political and financial interests of the president and his backers. Now here's where the Trump United States immunity decision intersects with this removal power case in absolutely chilling ways, because the 6 conservative justices in Trump United States extended the scope of the president's conclusive and preclusive powers derived from the Constitution itself to cover the ability to remove and direct the actions of the Justice Department for any reason whatsoever, which means Trump is effectively immune from prosecution for criminal acts now or in the future, and meetings where foreign nationals gain access to Trump and attempt to influence policy because they've personally enriched him result in policy changes. Those presidential decisions could be considered official acts receiving full immunity, creating a perfect storm where Trump versus United States has significantly weakened bulwarks within government that would traditionally investigate claims of public corruption, permitting the presidency more authority than America has seen in generations. So you have a president who can fire any prosecutor or regulator who investigates him, who enjoys criminal immunity for his official acts, and who can now potentially purge entire independent agencies of anyone who won't rubber stamp his agenda. And if you're thinking surely the courts will stop this, then you haven't been paying attention, because the Supreme Court subsequently ruled in favor of the administration's actions and an expansive view of presidential power, with the justices appearing split along ideological lines, similarly to how they ruled on the emergency docket, meaning we know exactly how this ends. The infrastructure of authoritarianism is being built with frightening precision. This authoritarian playbook from Project 2025 would destroy the 250-year-old system of checks and balances to create an imperial presidency, and if implemented, the United States would be unrecognizable, instead resembling autocracies like Hungary and Turkey, which severely weakened their democracies and vested inordinate power in authoritarian leaders, and we're watching it happen in real time as elected authoritarians in Turkey, Hungary, and Poland used centralization of executive control to destroy democratic governments, amending constitutions or passing legislation allowing chief executives to remove incumbents critical of government policies, with prosecution services, then protecting ruling party supporters and persecuting opponents. That's the playbook, and Trump's administration is conducting an integrated, systematic attempt at executive aggrandizement through eliminating executive constraints and asserting dominance over judicial and legislative branches, weakening core institutions of legal and political accountability essential for democratic governance, while this unconstitutional effort to turn the presidency into an unaccountable autocracy has taken the United States to the brink of authoritarianism. But let's ground this in the specific exchange you just watched, because the casual manner in which Solicitor General Sauer states there are no permissible restrictions on presidential removal of principal officers should send shivers down your spine. This isn't some abstract legal position, but rather the operational theory by which Trump has already removed Democratic members from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Merit Systems Protection Board, and Consumer Product Safety Commission, and when Thomas presses him on whether it can be completely arbitrary, Sauer doesn't flinch, doesn't qualify, doesn't offer even the pretense of constraint. He just doubles down that any bad reasons are only subject to politics, not law, which is another way of saying, if you don't like the president firing people for corrupt or criminal or nakedly partisan reasons, then your only recourse is winning the next election, except those elections would no longer be free and fair, when the president controls the Federal Election Commission and every other agency that might check his power or investigate his corruption. And the bitter irony here is that in Humphrey's executor, the court unanimously held that while presidents can remove purely executive officers for any reason, that unlimited power does not extend to agencies like the FTC, whose duties are neither political nor executive, but predominantly quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative, a distinction that made perfect sense because Congress was trying to create regulatory bodies that could develop expertise and make decisions based on evidence rather than partisan whim. But Humphrey's executor has long been a target of the conservative legal movement, embracing the unitary executive theory, with proponents saying the modern administrative state gets the Constitution all wrong, because federal agencies in the executive branch answer to the president, including ability to fire leaders at will. Never mind that Congress created the FTC in 1914 as a bipartisan independent agency where the 5-member commission can have no more than 3 members of the same party, and commissioners can only be fired for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance, because in the conservative legal movement's vision, those congressional judgments about institutional design mean nothing when balanced against their theological commitment to maximal presidential power. What you're witnessing is not judicial restraint or originalism or textualism or any of the interpretive methodologies conservatives claim to champion. This is raw ideological power projection dressed up in constitutional language, Even a prominent proponent of originalism wrote that Roberts may be wrong about the history underpinning unitary executive theory, with Caleb Nelson stating, "Both the text and the history of Article 2 are far more equivocal than the current court has been suggesting," while historians filed briefs providing context about removal power in the country's early years that could lead the court to revise its views, though one law professor said, "I'm not holding my breath," and she's right to be cynical because under Chief Justice Roberts, the Supreme Court has embraced unitary executive theory, giving the president broad Article 2 authority over federal government operations, systematically whittling away since 2010 at laws restricting presidential firing power, with Roberts writing in 2020 that the president's removal power is the rule, not the exception, in clear preparation for this moment. So when you watch Clarence Thomas in that clip methodically probing for the outer boundaries of presidential impunity, understand he's not seeking information, he's auditioning justifications for a decision already made, signaling to the conservative legal movement that the court is prepared to go all the way, to finally overturn Humphrey's executor and enshrine in constitutional law a vision of presidency as elected monarchy, because Justice Kagan wrote that the majority may be raring to take that action, preventing the president from giving the president the unlimited removal power Congress denied him. And Monday's hearing confirmed exactly that, with few conservatives seeming concerned about the consequences, with Alito telling the Solicitor General, "It's been suggested if we rule for you, the entire government will fall," then dismissively adding, "The sky will not fall," which is precisely what authoritarians always say right up until the moment when the sky does fall, and by then it's too late to rebuild the guardrails you've demolished. The stakes here transcend any single policy dispute, because the outcome will determine whether any Democrats are left on the FTC or other regulatory bodies, and whether independent agencies will be truly independent any longer, which means every protection you take for granted, every regulation that keeps poison out of your food or prevents your bank from stealing your money, or stops your employer from exposing you to deadly working conditions, all of it becomes contingent on the momentary political preferences of whoever controls the White House, and if courts uphold the unitary executive theory, it would give Trump and subsequent presidents unprecedented power to remove and replace any federal employee and impose their will on every agency decision, jeopardizing the independence of key regulatory agencies like the Federal Election Commission. This isn't about whether you like particular regulations. This is about whether there exists any domain of governmental expertise and independence that can withstand the forces of corruption and partisanship, whether there are any adults in any room who aren't subject to instantaneous termination the moment they tell a president something he doesn't want to hear. And we need to be absolutely explicit about the dangers here, because unitary executive theory embracing presidential removal of agency heads for political reasons provides a pathway to autocracy, yet the Supreme Court has not taken the risk of losing democracy into account in its recent decisions, approving the theory, leaving America at risk of permanently losing democracy, while expanding presidential power limits, federal bureaucracy authority, even as the court curtailed agency power through overturning Chevron deference, and while Trump takes advantage of expanded executive authority, his actions conflict with Justice's theory that agencies aren't accountable, creating the absurdity that in the name of enhancing accountability, we've taken power away from accountable administrative agencies whose policies change with each election, and given that power to judges where there's no accountability. It's incoherent as constitutional theory, but perfectly coherent as authoritarian practice, concentrating power in unelected judges who serve for life, and presidents who increasingly operate beyond legal constraint, while eviscerating the career civil servants who actually implement policy and possess institutional knowledge. The moment you just witnessed in that hearing room represents democratic backsliding in its most crystalline form, and Levitsky and Ziblatt's framework shows democracies erode through gradual institutional decay, rather than abrupt takeovers, with Trump's presidency exemplifying this through persistent attacks on judiciary, media, and electoral integrity that undermine these institutions' legitimacy, and by encouraging insurrectionist behavior, Trump signaled willingness to destabilize institutions rather than accept their role as checks on executive power, culminating in the January 6th Capitol riot, an unprecedented attack on democratic governance in the modern United States. And yet somehow we're now watching the Supreme Court validate and expand the very theories of unchecked presidential power that made that attack possible. Because here's the thing that should terrify you most. Trump already tried to overturn an election through force and fraud. He's already demonstrated he'll stop at nothing to retain power. And now the Supreme Court is systematically removing every institutional check that might constrain a second coup attempt, immunizing him from criminal prosecution for official acts, while giving him dictatorial control over every agency that might investigate or resist him. This isn't hyperbole, and it isn't partisan fear-mongering. Trump is smashing constitutional and legal guardrails to build an authoritarian presidency that cements his political power and harms Americans, acting far more aggressively than his first term by casting aside the Constitution and federal laws, shattering guardrails designed to protect checks and balances, and the Trump administration is seizing unprecedented power to implement extreme policies that hurt everyday people while depriving them of fundamental rights, all of it enabled by a Supreme Court majority built by Trump that could uphold efforts to expand presidential authority based on unitary executive theory, with both the administration and the court subscribing to this legal theory granting extraordinary power to the president. We are living through a constitutional crisis in slow motion, where each day brings new outrages that would have sparked impeachment proceedings in any previous era, but now barely register because the authoritarian groundwork has been so thoroughly laid, the norms so comprehensively shredded, the expectations so drastically lowered, that we've become numb to the dissolution of the republic happening in plain sight. So when Clarence Thomas asks that question about arbitrary removals, and the government lawyer confirms yes, completely arbitrary, beyond any judicial scrutiny, subject only to the political process, understand that you're hearing the death rattle of the administrative state, the final gasps of independent expertise and professionalized governance, giving way to a spoils system on steroids, where loyalty to the president becomes the only qualification that matters, where speaking truth to power becomes a firing offense, where the entire apparatus of federal regulation gets transformed into an instrument of presidential vengeance and partisan advantage. And this is happening not through democratic deliberation or legislative reform, but through judicial fiat by 6 unelected justices who've decided their ideological project of dismantling the New Deal state matters more than preserving the constitutional architecture that sustained American democracy for 2.5 centuries. And if that doesn't make you angry enough to fight back, then I don't know what will, because the guardrails are failing, the alarms are screaming, the scholars are warning us we're sliding into competitive authoritarianism, and we're running out of time to stop it before the damage becomes irreversible, and the American experiment in self-governance becomes just another cautionary tale about how democracies die not with a bang, but with a Supreme Court justice calmly asking whether presidential power can be completely arbitrary, and a government lawyer answering yes while the republic burns.